I'm going to go ahead and now withdraw your co-host privileges. So just so you know, that's going to be coming up next. The presiding judge is going to be the co-host for the meeting. So just want to let you know that that's what's going to happen next. Okay, we've got the go-ahead and begin the round. You guys can go ahead and proceed.
All right. Let's call the case of Stevie Rogers versus Drew Mars. My name is Judge Maggie Randall Schutte, and we will start with any pretrial matters. Scoring judges, please make sure your video and audio are muted. So the only people you should see on the screen are me and 2 attorneys. All right, any pretrial matters from the plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor. First, may we make appearances?
Of course.
Good morning. My name is Madeline Driscoll, and along with my co-counsel, Matt Bessman.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
We represent the plaintiff in today's case, Ms. Stevie Rogers.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Now, Your Honor, we do have a few housekeeping matters to attend to. First, I'd like to direct your attention to the pretrial order by the Honorable Judge Page that should have been provided to you in a bench book. Now,
Yes.
Number 13 of the evidentiary rulings states that all witnesses, save for Stevie Rogers, the plaintiff, and Drew Mars, the defendant, have already been sequestered.
Any objections to that defense?
No objection, Your Honor.
All right, everyone is sequestered except for Rogers and Mars.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, number 17 of that pretrial order states that exhibits 1 through 7 are pre-admitted and that either side may refer to those documents at any time throughout the course of today's trial.
Is that your understanding as well, Ms. Burdett?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, exhibits 1 through 7 have been admitted and may be referred to at any time.
Yes, Your Honor. And then we just have one question for Your Honor. Now, due to the nature of today's trial, we will be sharing exhibits on the screen. For exhibits that have not been pre-admitted, would you like us to wait to share those exhibits on the screen until they have been admitted? Or would you be amenable to us sharing those exhibits constructively outside of the view of the jury before we admit them?
Defense, what would be your preference?
If it would be all right with Your Honor, I think the defense would be happy just to have the exhibits on the screen, assuming they're constructively outside the presence of the jury before they're admitted and then the jury actually sees them.
I think that's fine. Just note when you're doing that, whether it's been admitted or not. And I trust all of the advocates to object if something is referenced without being admitted first in a way that's inappropriate.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. And with that, the plaintiff is ready to go.
Any pretrial from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. First, may we make introductions?
You may.
Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Katie Burdett, and I will be joined today along with my co-counsel, Mr. Harsha Sridhar.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
And we are representing the defendant in today's case, Ms. Drew Mars.
Good morning, Your Honor.
Good morning.
We just have one more matter to take care of, Your Honor. We would just like the court to take note that according to the rules of evidence 603, all witnesses have been presumed to be pre-sworn, so we won't have to go through that throughout today's trial.
Yes, that's my understanding of Rule 603 as well. Witnesses, I know you're not on video, but you're listening, you've been pre-sworn. Please tell the truth.
Yes, Your Honor. With that, we're ready to proceed to openings.
All right. We are now proceeding to opening statements, and I'll ask that everyone change their view to speaker view, which is in the top right. And I will, and please everyone make sure you are muted, including the attorney who is not speaking during opening statements. So Plaintiff, you can proceed with your opening.
Yes, Your Honor. May it please the court. It wasn't enough. It's August 15th, 2018. The defendant, a woman named Drew Mars, wakes up early. She's a caretaker for an elderly woman named Agatha Lee, so that morning she goes to Miss Lee's bedroom. The defendant walks into the room and she sees Agatha Lee lying lifeless in her bed. Miss Lee's not moving. She's not breathing. She's not waking up. There's no pulse, but what you'll learn today, the defendant's not worried. She's not surprised. She's not upset. Members of the jury, you'll learn the defendant's not worried because she already knew Agatha Lee would be dead. The defendant's not worried because she was the one who killed her. You see, Agatha Lee was a very wealthy woman. You'll learn today that her estate was worth more than $20 million, and she used some of that money to make sure the defendant had a comfortable life. You'll learn that she paid for the defendant's housing, gave her free food, and paid her a generous salary, but for the defendant, that money wasn't enough. You'll learn that's because the defendant had a sister who was fatally ill. You'll hear that the medical treatment for that illness was extremely expensive. Even with the defendant's salary, she just couldn't afford it. But you'll learn the defendant wasn't worried. At least, not yet. That's because the defendant was Agatha Lee's sole inheritor. Now, this meant that when Agatha Lee died, the defendant would get her $20 million estate. Now, that money, that would be enough. But then on August 14th, 2018, everything changed. You'll learn that on that day, the defendant overheard a conversation between Agatha Lee and Miss Lee's grandson, a woman named Stevie Rogers. Now, the defendant heard Agatha Lee say that she would be changing her will at the end of the week. That instead of leaving that $20 million to the defendant, she planned to leave it to Stevie Rogers instead. The defendant had to make sure that never happened. So she came up with a plan. You'll learn that immediately after hearing that conversation, the defendant took a trip to the pharmacy. She bought a bottle of an over-the-counter medication called chlorantranine, a drug she knew Agatha Lee was fatally allergic to. When the defendant got home, she swapped one of Agatha Lee's regular medicines for a dose of that lethal drug. Members of the jury, the defendant poisoned Agatha Lee to make sure she never got a chance to change her will, to make sure she got that $20 million. That is why we are here today. Miss Lee's granddaughter, Stevie Rogers, has sued the defendant under the Slater statute. Now, what this statute says is that if a person kills someone else, that person can't inherit that other person's money. This means that we must prove by a preponderance of the evidence, which just means it's more likely than it is not, that the defendant knowingly or purposefully caused Miss Lee's death. When we meet this burden today, the defendant won't have access to that $20 million. Now, that money will go to Stevie Rogers instead, just like Miss Lee wanted. You're actually going to get a chance to meet Miss Rogers today. She's going to take the stand and she's going to tell you all about her grandmother. She'll tell you how on the day her grandmother died, she caught the defendant eavesdropping on a conversation about Miss Lee's will. How later that night, she saw the defendant sneaking into Agatha Lee's bedroom, hiding something in her hand. You'll also hear from a man named Marco Bond, a private investigator who looked into Agatha Lee's death. Mr. Bond will tell you that when confronted with the facts of this case, the defendant lied. He'll tell you that all of the physical evidence, all the forensic evidence points to the defendant killing Agatha Lee. Members of the jury, by the end of today's trial, you'll know exactly why the defendant chose to do that. Because even though Agatha Lee put a roof over her head, fed her, put her through school, paid her a generous salary, showed her love and compassion for the defendant, all of that was never enough. You'll learn the defendant wanted more. So she took Agatha Lee's life too. That's why at the end of today's trial, we're going to ask that you find the defendant liable. Thank you.
Thank you. Defense?
Opening, Your Honor. May it please the court. It was murder, but it wasn't Mars. On August 15th, 2018, Drew Mars walks into the room of a woman she's taken care of for over 10 years, Miss Agatha Lee. Miss Lee isn't moving. She's not breathing. Panicked, Miss Mars seeks help from the only other person living in that house, Miss Lee's estranged granddaughter, the plaintiff. Now, you'll learn today there was one person that morning that wasn't worried about what was going on, and it sure wasn't Miss Mars. It was the plaintiff. Because you'll learn the plaintiff's first reaction when hearing about her grandmother's death wasn't shock, but instead it was to call a private investigator. But members of the jury, before that investigator got there, before the autopsy, before the toxicology report, the plaintiff was already accusing Miss Mars of murder. You see, it's pretty easy to be sure of what happened when you're the one who killed her. Because you see, it was murder. But you'll learn today it wasn't Mars. It was the plaintiff. The evidence will show that the plaintiff arrived at Lee Manor a month before her grandmother's death with a single goal in mind: to get back in her grandmother's will. You see, the plaintiff had already blown through a $2 million trust fund, and like Miss Driscoll said, that wasn't enough for the plaintiff. She had her eyes on that $25 million estate. But you'll see, when the plaintiff learned that she wasn't going to get a single penny of her grandmother's estate, she had to get creative. She had to come up with a different plan. Today, you'll learn that it was the plaintiff that killed Miss Lee, and you'll learn that the plaintiff planted evidence and paid an investigator to try and pin it all on Drew Mars. So you may be asking yourself why. How would the plaintiff benefit from her grandmother's death? And it's actually quite simple. You see, when her grandmother removed her from the will, Miss Lee decided to name her caretaker of 10 years, Miss Drew Mars, as the sole heir to that $25 million estate. Now, Miss Mars is the only thing standing between the plaintiff and that $25 million that she wants. In order for her to get that money, she has to overturn her grandmother's will. And that brings us to the final step of the plaintiff's plan, this lawsuit. Because like the plaintiff mentioned earlier, there's a law called the Slayer Statute, and you'll learn today that the plaintiff knew about this law long before the legal proceedings today. In order for the plaintiff to overturn the will and get that $25 million, she has to prove that Miss Mars knowingly or purposefully caused the death of Miss Lee. And you'll see the plaintiff won't be able to meet that burden because it was murder, but it wasn't Mars. We, as the defense, don't have a burden of proof, but we will show you who actually killed Miss Lee by calling 2 witnesses. First, you're going to have a chance to meet Miss Drew Mars, Miss Lee's caretaker of over 10 years. And she'll tell you about her relationship with Miss Lee, that the 2 of them were as close as family. She'll also tell you about a conversation she overheard on August 14th, the day before Miss Lee was found dead. You'll learn that Miss Lee told the plaintiff that she wasn't going to get a single penny of that $25 million estate. The very next day, she was found dead. And Miss Mars will tell you from the moment that body was found, the plaintiff was blaming and accusing Drew Mars. Next, you're going to hear from Ryan Cabrera. He was writing Miss Lee's biography and had frequent contact with her in the months before her death. And he'll tell you that the plaintiff's claim that Miss Lee was going to add the plaintiff back in the will, well, that just doesn't match up with what Miss Lee told Mr. Cabrera over those few months. Today, you'll learn that the plaintiff orchestrated Miss Lee's death, that the plaintiff poisoned her with 2 pills of chloroangemine, and that the plaintiff is trying to now pin it all on Drew Mars to get that $25 million. Now, the plaintiff's going to try and tell you a story about murder. And it was murder, but it wasn't Mars. That's why at the end of today's trial, my co-counsel Harsha Sridhar will stand before you and ask that you find for Drew Mars. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Before plaintiff starts with their witness presentation, if everyone will please change your view back to gallery view. So this way you'll be able to see the attorney and the witness on the screen. And plaintiff, if you'll call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor, the plaintiff calls Ms. Stevie Rogers. May I proceed?
You may.
Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Hi, my name is Stevie Rogers.
Why are you here today?
I'm here because my grandmother, Agatha Lee, died on August 14th of 2018. And I believe that her caretaker, Drew Mars, was the person that killed her.
Ms. Rogers, we're going to talk about your grandmother's death, but first I want the members of the jury to get to know her. Could you tell them a little bit about your grandmother?
Sure. My grandmother was an author. She wrote the mystery book, Death in a Bottle. It's a really popular book. Maybe you've heard of it, but she would never talk about it herself. She was really one of the most humble people I've ever known.
What was your relationship with your grandmother like?
We were really, really close. Both of my parents actually passed away back in 2008. And after that happened, we were the only family left. So we really bonded over that.
Ms. Rogers, how did the 2 of you handle your parents' death?
Well, we spent almost every single day together. We would play backgammon together, went for lots of walks. We watched Jeopardy almost every night. It was a simple life, but we had a lot of fun together.
Did you stay close?
I tried to, but after a few years, I decided that I wanted to travel. My parents had always encouraged me to travel when I had the opportunity, and 3 years later, I decided to take their word for it. So I decided to go overseas, and while I was there, I started writing 2 tourism novels focused on solo traveling. But because I was overseas, that also meant that I wasn't able to talk to my grandma as much as I would have liked.
Well, how often did the 2 of you talk?
Well, we called on big days like birthdays, and we sent letters about major life updates. But the last letter that I got from her was actually in February of 2018, and I learned that I was being disinherited from her will.
Ms. Rogers, would you recognize that will if I showed it to you?
Yes.
Mr. Bussman, could I get Exhibit 9 on the screen, please? Is this that will you just mentioned?
Yep, this is it.
Does it appear to be a fair and accurate copy?
Yes.
Has it been changed in any way since the last time you saw it?
No.
The plaintiff offers Exhibit 9.
Any objections?
None, Your Honor.
Exhibit 9 is admitted without objection.
Now, Ms. Rogers, what did you learn from this will?
I learned that my grandma's caretaker, Drew Mars, would be inheriting everything from my grandma after she passed away.
Does this will mention your name at all?
Yes, it does.
What does it say?
It says, I specifically intend to exclude my grandchild, Stevie Rogers, from receiving any benefit from my estate or under this will.
Thank you, Mr. Bussman. Now, Ms. Rogers, how did you react to finding out that you had been disinherited?
Well, I mean, of course I was surprised, but I wasn't really worried about the money aspect of it. I had plans to publish both of my books that I had written once I got back to the US. Really, what this letter showed me was that I definitely wasn't spending as much time as my grandma as I should have been, and I felt really bad about that.
So did you come back to the United States?
Yeah, I did. I came a few months later in June of 2018. The next month, July, was the 10th anniversary of my parents' death. And I really just thought that my grandma and I should be together for that.
When did you go and see your grandmother?
On the 4th of July in 2018, I came to Lee Manor, which is where she lived.
How long did you stay?
I stayed a few weeks, actually, up until she passed away.
During those few weeks, could you tell the members of the jury what your relationship was like with your grandmother?
Sure. It was wonderful. It was just like the old times, really. We did all the things that we did when I was there back in 2008. We had a great time together.
When you were staying at Lee Manor, was there anyone else staying there?
Yes, Drew Mars was living there.
And you mentioned before that Drew Mars, the defendant, was your grandmother's caretaker. What sorts of things would you see her do for your grandmother?
Well, when I was there, usually I was the one taking care of her most of the time, but I guess I did see Drew do some things like refill my grandma's pill organizer and take her temperature, things like that.
What was your relationship with Drew Mars like?
Well, it was fine at first. We were the same age. I thought we'd be able to get along, but after a little while, Drew just started acting really weird.
What do you mean?
She was constantly just hovering over us. Like if I wanted to go grab my grandma a book, Drew would step in and say that she wanted to do it instead. Or if I was having a private conversation with my grandma, I could usually look around and I would find Drew just standing there. It really made me uncomfortable.
Do you remember the last time you saw Drew Mars hovering around where you and your grandmother were having a conversation?
Yeah. My grandma and I were in her study and she told me that she had changed her mind and that she had decided to leave her entire estate to me. My grandma gave me a hug and a kiss, and then we walked out of the study together, and there was Drew. She was just standing there.
Did the defendant say anything?
Not at first. She made this really big, weird smile at my grandma and said, "I'll get the car." And then she turned to me and her expression completely changed. I mean, I had never even seen her like that. She looked irate. Her fists were clenched, her face was all red. She just glared at me and said, "No way."
Ms. Rogers, what day was that?
on August 14th. It was on the day that my grandmother passed away.
Now, after you had this conversation with your grandmother, how did you spend the rest of the day?
Well, after my grandma got back from lunch, we watched a movie together. We had a pretty early dinner, and then my grandma went to bed. I remember saying goodnight and I love you. And that was the last thing that I ever got to say to her.
After you said goodnight to your grandmother, did you see the defendant?
Yeah, just a few minutes after I came back downstairs, I saw Drew walking around upstairs.
What was the defendant doing?
Well, she walked out of her bedroom and her hand was up like this. It looked like she was holding something. And then she sort of tiptoed across the upper level and walked right into my grandma's bedroom.
When you saw the defendant walk into your grandmother's room, did you say anything?
No. And looking back, I would do anything to step in and say something, but I just figured Drew was doing her job. I mean, I trusted her to take care of her at least.
What happened the next morning?
I woke up from pounding on my door. Drew walked in and she told me that grandma wasn't waking up. I couldn't believe it. I mean, she had seemed so healthy the week before. I mean, we had just gone on a walk together the night before. I knew right away that something was off.
So what did you do?
I called an investigator, Marco Bond. It was just too much of a coincidence between the way Drew had been acting and then seeing her in the hallway after that will conversation and then seeing her walk into my grandma's room. So I told them they needed to do an autopsy.
Do you know if they ever did do that autopsy?
Yeah, they did.
Would you recognize the results if I showed them to you?
Yeah.
Mr. Bressman, could I get Exhibit 2 on the screen, please? Ms. Rogers, is this that autopsy?
Yes.
What does this autopsy tell you about your grandmother's cause of death?
My grandma was poisoned by a drug called chlorandramine.
Before you read this autopsy, had you ever heard of that drug chlorandramine before?
Yeah, I heard about it from Drew Morris, actually. She had told me that my grandma was allergic to it.
Did the defendant say anything else about that drug?
Yeah, Drew told me that chlorandramine could kill my grandma.
Thank you, Ms. Rogers. Your Honor, at this time, I have nothing further.
Thank you. Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Just a moment. Do you need a moment there, Ms. Rogers?
I'm okay, but thank you.
All right, now you talked a lot about Drew Mars, but I want to talk about you and I actually want to pick up right where you left off.
Okay.
You told us your grandmother died of an allergic reaction to chlorandramine.
Yes.
And like you said a minute ago, you were actually aware that she was deadly allergic to that drug, right?
Yes.
You learned about that in the first week of August 2018.
I think so.
And in that same conversation, Drew Mars told you that chlorandramine was an over-the-counter drug.
Yeah, it was pretty common apparently.
That means that you can go down to a pharmacy and buy it, right?
I think.
It means that you can buy it without a prescription. You know, that's what an over-the-counter drug is.
Yeah.
2 weeks after you learned that your grandmother was deathly allergic to a drug you could buy at the pharmacy, she was dead.
Yes.
And she died of chloroandramine in the same house where you were living.
Yes, me and Drew Mars were both living there.
That's right, but right now I'm just talking about you, and you lived in that same house.
That's right.
Well, then I want to talk about where you were on August 14th, 2018.
Okay.
Now, you claim that you were at Lee Manor all day, right?
Yep.
But ma'am, you can't actually prove that, can you?
What do you mean?
Well, you have a car, right?
Yeah.
You can't prove to us that you didn't drive that car to a pharmacy to pick up chloroandramine.
I mean, I'm telling you right now that I didn't.
Right, but we have to take your word for it, right?
Yeah.
Oh, ma'am, there were times that day when you were home alone, right?
That's right.
Well, then let's talk about Lee Manor for a second. You lived there for a few months.
Yeah, a couple weeks.
And as far as you know, the only room in that entire house with a lock is Agatha Lee's bedroom.
Yeah, I think so.
That means that as far as you know, ma'am, there's no lock that would stop you from entering Drew Mars's bedroom.
I guess not.
No lock that would stop you from putting a bag in Drew Mars's closet.
No, but I didn't do that.
Oh, ma'am, right now I'm not asking you to defend yourself. I'm just asking whether there was a lock that could stop you from doing that. And as far as you know, there wasn't, right?
I don't think.
Oh, ma'am, I also want to talk about what you knew about your grandmother's habits.
Okay.
Now, when you were at home alone on August 14th, you were aware that Agatha Lee took medication every night, right?
Yeah.
And you knew that she doesn't pick out those medicines from bottles every day, right?
No, Drew fills up her pill organizer.
That's right. Your grandmother used a pill organizer.
Yeah.
And you'd seen that pill organizer on Agatha Lee's bedside table before?
Yeah.
And you knew that every night she would take the pills that were in that pill organizer like clockwork.
Yeah.
Well, then, ma'am, I want to talk about how you might have benefited from Agatha Lee's death. Now,
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead, ma'am.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, 5 days after Agatha Lee died, you filed this lawsuit, right?
Yeah.
5 days before Agatha Lee died. That's before the police finished their report.
I think.
That's before your own private investigator, Mr. Bond, finished his report.
Yeah.
And that's actually before the toxicology screen came back.
Yeah.
Ma'am, you said something interesting in your deposition. You said, I knew exactly what that toxicology report was going to show. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
And ma'am, this law you're suing under, the Slayer statute, you knew about this law before Agatha Lee died, right?
Yeah, I think I'd heard of it before.
Oh, ma'am, what you're suing for is Agatha Lee's entire estate. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
You're telling us because you think Drew Mars killed Agatha Lee, you should get all of Agatha Lee's money, her mansion, and all of her royalties.
Sure.
Well, then I want to talk about your financial history with Miss Lee.
Okay.
Now, like I said a few minutes ago, back in 2008, you were made the sole inheritor of Agatha Lee's will, right?
That's right.
And Your Honor, would it be all right if we put up a timeline?
Yes, that's fine.
And-
Unless there are any objections from the plaintiff.
No objections at this point, Your Honor.
Now, 3 years later, ma'am, you dropped out of law school, right?
Yes.
And your grandmother, she wasn't happy about that.
I wouldn't say so.
You'd agree she was not thrilled by your decision.
Right.
I want to talk about these next 7 years then, from 2011 to July of 2018. Now,
Okay.
when Ms. Burdett and I deposed you for this case, we asked you about that relationship and you said that it remained close. You and your grandmother were still close. Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about exactly how close you were. In those 7 years, You called Agatha Lee once.
Right. She was usually the one that reached out to me.
Well, ma'am, you picked up the phone and you called her once in 7 years, right?
That's right. On her birthday, I preferred to write letters.
Actually, she would send you letters sometimes.
Yeah.
You never sent her a letter.
I talked on the phone with her sometimes.
Ma'am, in those 7 years, you never sent her a letter, right?
No.
Well, then I
don't
want to
think
talk.
so.
All right, then let's talk about 2018. Now, in February of 2018, you received a letter from your grandmother.
Yes.
You recognize that letter if I showed it to you?
Yes.
Mr. Schroeder, could we put up Exhibit 10 on screen? Now, ma'am, this is the letter you received from your grandmother, right?
That's right.
It's a fair and accurate copy of that letter.
Yes.
And at this point, Your Honor, defense moves Exhibit 10 into evidence.
Any objections?
To hearsay, Your Honor.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor, the statements in this document fall under Rule 8033. These are statements both of intent and in motive. In this document, Agatha Lee describes her intent to cut the plaintiff out of the will, and the rest of the document goes to motive. It's Agatha Lee describing the reasons she is excluding the plaintiff from her will. Thus, this entire document falls under Rule 8033.
Response on those grounds?
Yes, Your Honor. Well, there are certain statements in this document that might be construed as a plan. The whole document does not fall under that exception 8033. Now, opposing counsel cited motive as a reason. However, what the Rule 8033 actually says is that statement of motive is inadmissible, not statement of motive of intent. Your Honor, I ask that this document be kept out of evidence because it is inadmissible hearsay. It doesn't fall under that exception.
I'm going to admit the last two paragraphs and exclude the first three paragraphs of this document.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Schuler, could we zoom into that fourth paragraph, which has been admitted? Ma'am, in this paragraph, Agatha Lee says that you and her, you've become family in name only, right?
Right.
She says she's disinheriting you from the will.
Yeah.
All right, ma'am, but when you got this letter, right, you weren't sweating it.
What do you mean?
Well, those were your words, right? You said that when you got this letter, you weren't thrilled, but you weren't exactly sweating it.
Right. Like I said, I had plans to publish both of my books. I wasn't really worried about the money, but I felt terrible that I hadn't been talking to my grandma as much as I should have been. So that's why I felt bad.
Well, ma'am, one of the reasons you weren't sweating it was you still had money in a $2 million trust fund, right?
Yeah, that's true.
In June of 2018, that trust fund was finally empty.
Yeah.
And then a month after that, that's when you saw your grandmother for the first time in 7 years.
That's true. That was the 10th anniversary of my parents' death.
And a month after you moved in with your grandmother, you found out she was deathly allergic to chloroandramine.
Yeah.
And 2 weeks later, she was dead.
Yes.
Ma'am, you mentioned that your trust fund was empty. You know that the total value of this estate you're suing for is $25 million.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Nothing further, Your Honor. And would opposing counsel... Okay. I was just about to ask if opposing counsel wanted the visual taken down, but it looks like we took the initiative on that one.
Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. I just ask that Ms. Rogers be excused.
Thank you, Ms. Rogers. You're excused. And plaintiff, you can call your next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The plaintiff calls Marco Bond to the stand.
Mr. Bond, remember you've been sworn?
Correct.
Sir, would you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Good afternoon. I'm Private Investigator Marco Marzello Bond, badge number 1.
How'd you get involved in private investigation?
Well, the story's not glamorous. I had suspicions my second wife was seeing another man. My rather expeditious discovery that she was cheating on me with the garbage guy helped me realize my investigative talents. I decided to quit my job at Goldman Sachs and start my own PI firm.
How long have you been working as a private investigator?
I got my license around 10 years ago and have since conducted investigation for the likes of Lady Gaga, Google, Bill de Blasio, and actually, Mr. Bestman, even your great uncle Alan.
Okay, well, how'd you get involved in this case?
I was telephonically apprised of a concern from a client, Stevie Rogers, on August 15th, 2018. She said something was afoot at the home of her grandmother, Agatha Lee.
Who's Agatha Lee?
Lee is the one nut in my career I had a little trouble cracking. She wrote an acclaimed mystery novel in the year 1968, then burrowed away in her nearly impenetrable countryside estate.
So what'd you do when you got that phone call?
I arrived on the scene to find Miss Lee stiff and pale as, well, a dead person.
Who else was there?
Stevie Rogers and in-home caretaker Drew Mars. Shortly thereafter, we were also blessed with the presence of Detective Khan.
What was everybody up to?
There was much bickering about how to handle the body. I was running through body preservation protocols, but Drew Mars kept interrupting, saying that we had to cremate Miss Lee.
What did you do?
I took a moment to tame my overwhelming sleuth suspicions. Then I began to take a look into Drew Mars.
What'd you find?
She hand-delivered me lightning in a bottle. Mars told me that she knew Agatha Lee had a fatal allergy to chloroandramine.
Well, how did you respond to that?
I inquired whether Mars would be so gracious as to let me search her room so Marco could look for a little polo.
How did the defendant respond?
She said, "No way, Jose." She was not going to let me search her room. Then when the police asked, she told him she wasn't going to be letting anyone in.
When was the next time you saw the defendant?
On the most notable day of high professional drama in my entire career, the reading of Miss Agatha Lee's will on August 20th, 2018.
What happened?
Miss Lee's lawyer seized the stage and proclaimed that Agatha Lee had left her entire estate to Drew Mars.
How did the defendant react?
She gave a better performance than De Niro in the face of my indisputable evidence of his infidelity. Mars told everybody she didn't know she would get everything if Agatha died. She kept saying she couldn't believe it. She had no idea.
Was that true?
Not in the slightest.
Objection,
know?
Your Honor, to lack of personal knowledge. May I be heard?
You may.
This witness, there's no foundation that this witness can testify that Miss Mars was lying when she said she didn't know. This witness doesn't know what knowledge Miss Mars had at the time that this will reading occurred, and therefore he cannot say whether or not she was lying.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. As you might have heard, my next question was going to be, how do you know? And if I could proffer for the court?
Yes.
I believe the witness is going to testify that he saw an email the defendant sent before the will reading, where the defendant admitted to knowing that she was going to inherit the entire estate. We were just about to enter that evidence.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
Yes, Your Honor, if I may proffer.
Yes.
That email was dated from February of 2018, over 6 months before this will reading occurred. Now, this witness, we have it in good faith that this witness is not going to be able to provide any other evidence that would show what Miss Mars's knowledge would be 6 months later at the time of the will reading. We have no problem with this witness telling us what she said and what he found 6 months prior, but to go that one step farther to say she was lying without knowing what her knowledge was at the day of the will reading, this witness can't testify to that. He lacks that personal knowledge.
May I be heard briefly on that, Your Honor?
I'm going to sustain for now, but lay the foundation, and then you can attempt to draw the conclusion again once the foundation is laid, and we'll address it at that point.
Yes, Your Honor.
Move to strike that portion where he said she was lying.
We will constructively strike it for now. Please feel free to raise your objection again. Please feel free to ask the question again once the foundation has been laid.
Yes, Your Honor.
Sir, did you ever get a look at the defendant's computer?
Yes, I had hacked into Ma's personal computer, and I had seen an email that Mars had sent around 6 months before Miss Lee perished that showed she knew she would inherit the estate.
Would you recognize that email if I showed it to you in court today?
Absolutely.
Ms. Driscoll, could we get Exhibit 13, please? Sir, is this the email you remember seeing?
Yes, it is.
Has it been changed in any way?
No,
Who took that picture?
me.
The plaintiff offers Exhibit 13 into evidence.
No objection, Your Honor.
Exhibit 13 is admitted without objection.
So what does this email say?
Agatha just told me she changed her will to leave everything to me. At first, I was in shock. I thought Agatha was just messing with me. But Agatha showed me a will that is dated today, saying Stevie, the no-good grandkid, is out, and I get everything. The house, the money, everything. We're talking millions of dollars. This is going to totally change my life.
When was this email sent?
February 1st, 2018.
So what did you do next?
Well, Detective Khan finally submitted to my investigative instincts and initiated an autopsy of Miss Lee's body.
Did you get to find out what that autopsy concluded?
That Agatha Lee died of an allergic reaction to chloroangerine. Ain't that a kick in the head?
What happened next?
After that bombshell, the cops were finally able to get a warrant to search Drew Ma's room.
Did you go with them?
Of course, if you want things done the right way, you watch other people do it yourself.
So what did you find?
Most notably, a mysterious black bag in the back of Ma's closet.
What did the police do with that bag?
Police diligently dusted this bag for any and all fingerprints.
Are you familiar with the pre-admitted police report?
Religiously.
Ms. Driscoll, can we get Exhibit 6 up? So what does that report conclude about fingerprints on the black bag inside the defendant's closet?
Buckle up, Mr. Bestman. On the zipper of this bag, there was a 16-point match for Drew Ma's right thumb.
Did you ever learn what was inside the bag?
Contained therein was a certain bottle of pills.
What did the police do with those pills?
Police consigned these pills to the forensics laboratory for thorough testing.
Are you familiar with the pre-admitted forensic analysis?
Yes, this is the chemical analysis of the pills found in that black bag.
Ms. Driscoll, can we get Exhibit 3? So what were those pills found in the bag in the defendant's closet?
None other than chloroangerine.
Thank you, Mr. Bond. No further questions, Your Honor.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed? Mr. Bond, I have a few more questions for you, all right?
Okay, about this case or the issue with your father-in-law that I uncovered?
With this case, Mr. Bond.
Okay, okay.
Mr. Bond, you are a private detective, right?
Yes,
You take a lot of pride in your work.
yes, I believe my own standards of accountability are much higher than any police department in the country.
People hire you to answer their questions.
Correct.
When your clients hire you, they expect results.
That's an
Objection,
investigation.
Your Honor, calls for speculation.
Response?
Your Honor, I'm just asking about this witness's understanding of his client's expectations of him. He has personal knowledge of that.
I'll sustain as the question was asked. You can feel free to rephrase.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Bond, when your clients hire you, you believe that they expect results, right?
The purpose of any investigation is to get to the bottom of what happened. Results.
So let's talk about the question that the plaintiff hired you to answer. At 8:45 a.m. on August 15th of 2018, you received a call from the plaintiff.
Correct.
And in that call, the plaintiff told you that someone had murdered her grandmother, Miss Agatha Lee.
Yes, it's a remarkable occasion when finally a granddaughter's innocent intuition bears out as fact.
So that's a yes, Mr. Bond?
Yes,
And the plaintiff hired you to figure out who killed her.
yes, Stevie Mars was under that suspicion that foul play was at hand. I wasn't quite there at the beginning, but the evidence just kept piling on.
So, Mr. Bond, that's a yes, the plaintiff hired you.
Correct.
And the plaintiff is paying you $25,000 to answer that question for her.
Yes,
And the plaintiff is paying you $25,000 despite the fact that the police were conducting their own simultaneous investigation.
like I said, my own standards of accountability and training are much higher than any police department. Yes,
When you got to Miss Lee's house at 9:25 a.m., the plaintiff, your client, already had an answer in mind as to who killed Miss Lee.
Objection, Your Honor, calls for speculation.
Response?
Your Honor, I'm asking this witness about what the plaintiff told him. He can testify to that. And if he doesn't know, he's more than free to say he doesn't know. This is cross-examination.
I'll sustain as asked. You can lay the foundation.
Yes, Your Honor. No. Mr. Bond, when you arrived at Miss Lee's house at 9:25 a.m., the plaintiff told you that she already had an answer in mind.
yes, she thought Drew Mars had killed her grandmother.
Well, 8 days later, you completed your investigation,
Correct.
and you found that you agreed with the plaintiff, your client.
Yes, initially I thought the death was by natural causes, but the evidence against Drew Mars just kept stacking up.
So that's a yes. You decided that you agreed with your client.
After much hesitance and skepticism, I ultimately came to that conclusion. Yes.
Well, I want to talk about some things you found, well, some things the police found during this investigation. You showed us a moment ago, well, you talked about a black bag found in Miss Mars's closet.
Correct, containing pills of the chloroandramine sorts.
You're aware that the police, well, they examined this box, right?
The bag?
The bag, yes.
Yes, yes.
And like you said, they found one half fingerprint that belonged to Drew Mars on the outside of that bag.
I wouldn't say a half fingerprint. It's a 16-point match, which by the standard of any Western country is more than enough to conclude someone's identity.
Well, they matched that half pink fingerprint to Drew Mars, right?
A
Objection, Your
16-point
Honor,
match.
assumes facts not in evidence.
Sorry, taking a second to unmute. Response?
Your Honor, I'm asking this witness the question. He
Remind
can
me
say
the
yes or
question.
no. I asked, they determined that this half fingerprint matched Drew Mars.
Is this contained within the exhibit that's pre-admitted?
Yes, according to the pre-admitted exhibit, this is shown in Exhibit 3.
If I may, Your Honor, it actually isn't. Nowhere in that exhibit does it say it's a half fingerprint. And the witness actually disagreed with that characterization earlier. That's why the question assumes a fact, not an evidence, that the partial print was a half fingerprint.
I'll overrule. You can ask the question, and Mr. Bond, you can answer as you see fit.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Bond, this partial fingerprint, the police determined it matched Drew Marr's.
Yes, like I said, it was a 16-point match, which is 4 points higher than any match needed to make a definitive conclusion about whose print it is.
But to be clear, Mr. Bond, the police also found numerous other smudges on the outside of that bag.
There were prints that were unusable, obfuscated prints with no identity attached to them.
That's right. There were fingerprints on the outside of that black bag that the police don't know who they belong to, right?
Yes, as I just said.
For all you know, those fingerprints could belong to the plaintiff.
I have no idea who those fingerprints belong to.
And to be clear, Mr. Bond, the police didn't find any of Miss Mars's fingerprints on the inside of that bag.
Correct. The 16-point match was on the zipper of that bag.
The police didn't find any of Miss Mars's fingerprints on that bottle of chloroanthramine, right?
No, like I said, the 16-point match was on the exterior of the bag to open it.
Now I want to talk about something you found was important to your determination that Miss Mars was responsible.
Many things were found.
Well, you would agree that it's your belief that if a link can't be found between Miss Mars and a motive, well, then, in your own words, the case against her would crumble.
Yes, motive is integral to any investigation.
That's right. You believe motive is integral to the investigation.
To any investigation, that is a very important consideration.
I want to talk about what you thought Miss Mars's motive was in this case. You claim that you believe Miss Mars killed Agatha Lee because of this conversation she overheard between Miss Lee and the plaintiff.
Yes, to see Miss Mars act surprised to find that she would get the entire estate, knowing that I had seen an email months prior that she knew about this, was quite troubling.
Oh, Mr. Bond, I'm not talking about the will reading. I'm talking about a conversation on August 14th in which the plaintiff claims Miss Lee told her that she was going to get all this money.
Correct.
But to be clear, Mr. Bond, you don't have any recordings of that conversation?
I wasn't there. It's not Watergate-style investigation I do.
Right. You don't have any witnesses besides the plaintiff that claim to have overheard this conversation?
Correct.
Right. The only evidence you have that this conversation even occurred was what the plaintiff, your client, told you.
Sure, but because of that February 1st email, I know that Drew Mars was privy to this will information anyway.
I'm not asking you about the will information, Mr. Bond. I'm asking you about this conversation about changing the will. And the only evidence you have that this conversation happened is what the plaintiff, your client, who's paying you $25,000, told you.
Yes, that conversation was also about the will.
Thank you. No further questions.
Any redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. May the witness be excused?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Bond. At this point, plaintiff, do you have any further witnesses?
We don't, Your Honor. The plaintiff rests.
All right. We'll now take a 5-minute break. So if everyone will be back at 12:44 Eastern time, unless bailiff, if you have anything different.
That's perfect, Your Honor. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put the students into rooms by team. And that way you guys will be able to talk amongst yourselves for the 5-minute break, and then we'll come back together as a group.
And I'll remind the judges too that you will be on this room, which is being live streamed on YouTube.
All right, I'm launching the rooms now.
Emily, can you hear me okay? I just had to change my headphones.
I can hear you perfectly.
Excellent.
Mhm. All right, I'm going to go ahead now and close all the rooms.
Okay.
So the students will return.
And Emily, do we have all the judges still here?
That's exactly what we're going to do. So judges,
Perfect.
before we begin, I need to be sure that all judges are present. Judges, would you please turn on your videos or send me a message so that I can confirm all judges are back? Your competitor, that's not necessary. So judges only, can you please show? All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and mark off the people that I see to keep track. All right. Good. Check. Let's see. Cameron, are you present? Max, are you present? Okay, we're going to go ahead and sit tight until we hear back from two of our jurors here, and then we'll proceed. Okay, great. So Cameron's back. Max, are you back?
Yes, I'm back.
Perfect. All right. In that case, we are all set and ready to proceed. And we can go ahead and begin, Your Honor.
All right. If everyone will continue to make sure you're set in gallery view, and defense, you can call your first witness.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Miss Drew Mars to the stand. May I proceed?
You may. And just for y'all's reference, once I've said you can call your witness, you don't have to ask to proceed, just for ease of me not having to find my mute button so I can talk.
Of course, Your Honor. Please introduce yourself to the members of the jury.
Hello, I'm Drew Mars.
Why are you here?
I'm here today because Stevie Rogers is accusing me of poisoning her grandmother, Agatha Lee. Miss Lee left me her estate and Stevie's suing me to get it.
Did you poison Agatha Lee?
No, of course not. I mean, Agatha, she was like family to me. At some points, she took care of me a lot more than I took care of her. I could never.
Who is Agatha Lee?
Miss Lee, she was my employer. I mean, I worked as her caretaker, but the day-to-day, it was a lot more complicated than that. I started working for her my junior year of college, and as soon as I graduated, I moved straight out of the dorms and into her house. And it was just like that for the next 10 years. The two of us, I mean, first thing we did was together. The last thing we did before we went to sleep was together. We shared our lives.
Did Miss Lee have any relatives?
Yeah, she had one granddaughter, Stevie Rogers.
During the 10 years that you took care of Miss Lee, how often did you see the plaintiff?
Once or twice before we moved to Midlands in 2011, but after we moved, we didn't see Stevie around until she showed up in 2018.
Did Miss Lee ever talk to you about her relationship with the plaintiff?
All the time. I mean, you could tell it really bothered her. She told me that she was hurt, that Stevie wouldn't come around, and for years she would be calling Stevie. She would email her, but she never got a response. So it felt to her like she had
Objection, Your Honor, to hearsay.
Response?
Yes, can I ask what statement that opposing counsel is referring to?
Yes, specifically to the statement that she never got a response to the phone calls or the emails.
Your Honor, there's no statement being elicited there. Drew Mars was there. She saw there was no response.
I agree, overruled. Yeah, on hearsay grounds, overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Miss Lee, or excuse me, Miss Marr, would you recognize a copy of a letter that Miss Lee wrote to the plaintiff in February of 2018?
I'm sure I would. I saw most of Miss Lee's letters before she sent them.
Could we please have Exhibit 10 on the screen? Do you know why Miss Lee sent this letter?
Yeah. She says that it felt like her and Stevie were only family in name now. And she sent this letter to let her know that she was removing her from the will.
If Miss Lee was removing the plaintiff from the will, Do you know who she named to inherit her estate instead?
She named me.
Do you know why?
Well, for the past 10 years, it had just been the two of us. Like I said, I mean, we did everything together, and she told me that she was grateful I had stuck by her during those times. I mean, like it says in this letter, I was with her through thick and thin.
How did you react when she told you?
I mean, I could say I was shocked. It was a lot of emotion at once. Of course, I mean, I was her employee. She paid me. She gave me a place to sleep, a place to eat, and she took care of me way more than enough already. She didn't need to do anything else. So I felt kind of overwhelmed. She was so generous to me, but I guess you could say I was grateful because obviously it showed that this relationship meant a lot to her, and it meant a lot to me too. So that was important.
I now want to talk to you about the morning of August 14th, 2018. We've
Okay.
heard a lot about that today. Did you ever hear Miss Lee and the plaintiff discuss Miss Lee's will?
Yeah, I did. I was bringing Miss Lee her tea like I do every morning. And as I got close to her study, I overheard them talking.
What were they saying?
Well, I heard Stevie ask Miss Lee about her decision to take Stevie out of the will. She asked her to reconsider.
And what did Miss Lee say?
She said no. That's what I heard.
Did you hear anything else?
I heard Stevie. I heard Miss Lee say that she loves Stevie and she wanted to support her, but she thought that Stevie needed to stand on her own 2 feet. Miss Lee said she wouldn't pay for Stevie's lifestyle anymore, and she wasn't going to give Stevie a penny.
Did you hear anything after that?
No, I didn't hear anything else. After that, they both got up and they left. Miss Lee went to go get ready for lunch with Mr. Cabrera, but Stevie, she stayed by the door. And as she walked past me, she looked at me and she glared at me and she snarled, "Don't count your millions yet."
After the plaintiff told you, "Don't count your millions yet," what happened for the rest of the day?
I mean, nothing of note. It was a pretty normal day. I cooked Miss Lee dinner like I normally do. Her and Stevie ate that dinner in the study like they normally do about 6 p.m. And then we all went to sleep, or at least I went to sleep at 9:30.
What happened the next morning?
Well, I was bringing Miss Lee her coffee at about 8:30 that morning, and I went into her room, but she wasn't moving. So I went over and I tried to shake her a little bit to wake her up, but she wouldn't wake up. And then I realized she wasn't breathing either. So I checked her pulse and there was nothing. She was cold. I didn't know what to do. So I knew I had to tell Stevie. So I ran to Stevie's room and I knocked on her door and I told her how I found Miss Lee. And Stevie, she called the police. She called 911. And when they got there, the first thing she did was she accused me of murdering Miss Lee.
We've talked a bit about what you were doing on August 14th.
Yeah.
I want to talk to you about what, to your knowledge, the plaintiff had access to that day.
Okay.
Do you know if the plaintiff was aware Miss Lee was deadly allergic to chloroandramine?
Yeah, I told her when she showed up. I mean, since it was such a strong allergy, I needed her to know that we just didn't have any in the house and that she shouldn't bring any in here.
Did you ever tell the plaintiff how she could get her hands on chloroandramine?
I did. I told her that it was an over-the-counter drug that anyone could get at the pharmacy. I wanted to make sure she checked all of her medications that she bought for her or Miss Lee or whoever she got them for to make sure they didn't have chloroandramine in them.
Ms. Mars, to your knowledge, did the plaintiff have access to Miss Lee's medication that day?
I can't say for sure, but I do know that she had access to Miss Lee's bathroom. Her doors didn't lock to that room, and we were gone for most of the day while Stevie was there.
Now, you've been here in court with us all day, and I want to give you a chance to address some things we've heard.
Okay.
First, I want to talk about that black bag the police found in your closet. Was that bag yours?
No, it's not mine. I mean, I can't really tell you whose it is. Miss Lee used that closet as a storage closet, and there was a bunch of stuff in there that wasn't mine.
Do you know if you've ever touched this bag?
I can't tell you for sure. I mean, the closet was pretty messy. I moved stuff around to get to my stuff, and I'm not sure whose stuff was in there, so I could have touched it.
I now want to talk about the will reading that occurred on August 20th of 2018.
Okay.
Can you tell us about your reaction?
Yeah. The days leading up to that have been a lot. I mean, Stevie kept accusing me of murder, and I didn't know what to do in that particular moment. I mean, once the will was read, all eyes were on me, and I was overwhelmed. I made a split-second decision, and I acted like I didn't know that Miss Lee had left me her estate. Obviously, that wasn't the best decision, but in that moment, I just didn't know what to do. Everybody was looking at me. Stevie kept accusing me, and I was just so overwhelmed.
Miss Mars, do you know what would happen to Miss Lee's estate if the plaintiff is successful?
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for a legal conclusion.
Response.
Your Honor, I'm asking for this witness to tell us what her understanding of this case is. She's the defendant, and I'm asking her if she understands what's at stake potentially.
Response, Your Honor.
Yes.
Your Honor, I agree that what opposing counsel just said is admissible. However, that's not the way she framed the question. Opposing counsel asked what would actually happen to that estate. That's what the legal conclusion is, and that's what's inadmissible.
We'll let the witness answer as to her understanding. So overruled in part, sustained in part.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. Miss Mars, could you tell us what your understanding is of what would happen if the plaintiff is successful?
From what I know, if she is successful, Stevie gets all of Miss Lee's estate instead of me. And the will that specifically excluded Stevie gets overturned.
Thank you. I have no further questions this time, Your Honor.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Miss Mars.
Good afternoon.
My name's Madeline Driscoll. I'm just going to be asking you a few more questions, okay?
Of course.
Now, on direct examination, you told us you knew you were the sole inheritor of Agatha Lee's estate, right?
Yeah, she showed me the will and the letter which she told Stevie that I was the inheritor.
Now, to your knowledge, you knew this meant that if Agatha Lee died, you would get everything, right?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
That's the rights to her book, right?
Yes.
That's her mansion, true?
From what I understand, yes.
You would get Agatha Lee's $20 million in cash, right?
Yes, ma'am, that was also part of her estate.
Now, Miss Mars, your family needed that money, true?
I mean, my family didn't need money, but I was already sending over everything I earned from Agatha, so they were staying afloat just fine.
Miss Mars, your family needed Agatha Lee's estate, isn't that true?
Of course, they could benefit from more money, but at the point in time of her death, they were doing fine.
Is it your testimony that your family didn't need that money?
I said they could use it. Yes, ma'am.
Now, Miss Mars, your family never had very much money, right?
No, we were never that rich.
Like you just told us, you sent most of your paychecks to your family, right?
Yeah, I mean, Miss Lee gave me a place to sleep, stuff to eat. I didn't really need any expenses for myself, so I sent all my money to them.
That's right. That's because your family needed help paying rent, true?
That's correct.
They needed help with medical bills, right?
Yeah, my younger sister was pretty sick.
That's right. Your younger sister was terminally ill, right?
Yeah, and she just kept getting worse and worse. It didn't seem like anything was going to help her at that point.
Without Agatha Lee's $20 million, you wouldn't be able to afford that medical treatment, right?
Eventually, we wouldn't be able to. At the time, I was doing okay with the money that I had, but yeah, we wouldn't eventually.
So to continue paying to keep your sister alive, you needed that $20 million, true?
Eventually, but not at the moment.
You knew that if you got that $20 million, your family would never have to worry about money again, right?
Of course, that's an insane amount of money.
Ms. Mars, then in July of 2018, like you told us on direct examination, Stevie Rogers came to stay with you and Agatha Lee, right?
Yeah, she did.
Stevie Rogers and Agatha Lee started spending every moment together, right?
They did. I just tried to step back, give them their space. I mean, she hadn't seen Stevie for years. I mean, almost 10 years. So I just tried to give them time to do things together.
They ate all their meals together, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Ms. Mars, then on August 14th, 2018, you overheard them having a conversation in Miss Lee's study, right?
Yes, like I just said.
You told us a little bit about that conversation on direct examination, true?
That's correct.
On direct examination, you claimed that Agatha Lee told Stevie Rogers that Miss Rogers wasn't getting a cent, right?
Yeah, she said to Stevie that she wouldn't give her a penny.
Ms. Mars, that's not true, is it?
I can't say whether or not it's true, but she passed away after that, so I guess not.
Ms. Mars, you actually were here when Stevie Rogers was testifying, right?
I was in court.
You heard Miss Rogers testify that Agatha Lee said she would be changing her will, right?
She said that today, but I'm just saying that's not what I heard that morning.
That's a yes to my question. You heard Miss Rogers say that Agatha Lee told her she would be changing her will, right?
That's what she said today, but I didn't hear that.
Miss Rogers testified that Agatha Lee said she would be making an appointment with her attorney for later that week, true?
Today she said that, but I don't know where that's coming from because that was not the conversation that I heard take place on August 14th.
Well, Miss Mars, actually, after that conversation, you saw Agatha Lee on the phone, right?
I did.
She was talking to her attorney.
Yes, to her personal attorney.
She made an appointment to meet with her attorney later that week, true?
She made the appointment for Friday, yes, ma'am.
Well, Miss Mars, you know that if Stevie Rogers wins this case, you believe that she'll get that $20 million, right?
Yes, ma'am. The Agatha Lee's estate will go to her.
You won't get that $20 million, right?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
You believe that if Stevie Rogers wins this case, you won't get that money you need to help your sister, right?
I wouldn't say that, but I would not get that money. No, ma'am.
Ms. Mars, let's talk about what you did. One of your responsibilities as Agatha Lee's caretaker is to handle all of her medications, right?
Yeah, it's been my job for the 10 years I was with her.
You refilled her pill organizer every single Saturday.
Yes, I did.
Agatha Lee took 4 different medicines every night, right?
Yeah, they were standard.
Now, as her caretaker, as you testified on direct examination, you know Agatha Lee had a fatal allergy to chlorandramine, right?
Yeah, it caused a heart attack before I started working with her. And ever since then, we made sure not to keep any of it in the house, ever.
You know chlorandramine was an over-the-counter medicine you could buy at any pharmacy, right?
Yeah, that's why I warned Stevie about it.
You also knew chlorandramine was identical to another pill called Winterin, right?
Yes, an arthritis pill.
Winterin, that was one of the 4 medications Agatha Lee took every night, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Winterin and chlorandramine were the same size, true?
Yes, they
Same
looked
shape?
almost identical. They looked almost identical.
That's right. Without a chemical test, you wouldn't be able to tell those 2 pills apart, right?
Yeah, that's why you had to check the label. That's why I warned anybody who came to the house that they had to read the labels on things.
That's right. Ms. Mars, after you heard that conversation in Agatha Lee's study, you took a trip to the pharmacy, right?
After I dropped Miss Lee off at her lunch earlier, yes, I went to the pharmacy. I had to pick up a couple toiletries.
You paid in cash at that pharmacy, right?
Yeah, it was a routine visit.
And you know that a week later, chlorandramine pills were found in your closet, right?
That's what they told me. It was in that black bag. I don't know whose that was.
That's right, you're telling the members of the jury today you don't know where that black bag came from, right?
Yeah, I mean, Miss Lee put tons of stuff in that closet and I just never checked things that were there.
You're telling us you have no idea where that black bag full of chlorandramine pills got in your closet?
Yes, it's not mine.
You know your fingerprints were found on that bag, don't you?
I do know that, and I might have moved it, but I know that bag is not mine.
Let's talk about August 20th. That was the day of the will reading, right?
Yes, ma'am.
You all gathered in Agatha Lee's study, right?
Yeah, everyone was there.
The executioner read the will, true?
Yeah,
They announced that they would be leaving everything to you, right?
yeah, Miss Lee's whole estate.
When you found out you were getting that $20 million, you said, I don't believe it, right?
Yeah, like I said, in that moment, I didn't really know what to do, and I made a last-minute decision. It wasn't a good one.
You said I had no idea, right?
Yeah, I pretended like I didn't know.
That's right, Miss Mars. That was a lie, wasn't it?
Yeah, I didn't know.
Miss Mars, you lied to everyone in that room because you thought the truth would make it look like you had a motive, right?
I mean, yeah, ever since we had found Miss Lee, Stevie just kept accusing me and telling the cops that they should arrest me over and over again. I was overwhelmed. I didn't know what to do.
Thank you, Miss Mars. Your Honor, I have nothing further.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Miss Mars, I want to go back and talk about that black bag that Miss Driscoll brought up.
Okay.
Is there a lock on your door?
No, there's no lock on my door. Only to Miss Lee's.
Is there a lock on your closet door?
No, I mean, it was a storage closet, and so we didn't lock it.
Are you aware of any locks in the house that would have prevented someone from entering your room and entering that closet and leaving a bag of chloroandramine?
No, I mean, I didn't have a lock to my room or my closet or basically anything.
Thank you. Nothing further.
And I think I saw time has elapsed, so I assume
Yes,
there's
Your
no
Honor.
recross.
No recross, Your Honor.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Mars. You're excused. And defense, you can call your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Defense calls Ryan Cabrera. Please introduce yourself to the court, sir.
Hi, how are you? My name is Ryan Cabrera.
Where are you from?
Originally, I'm from Boston, but I move around a lot, partially because I keep getting evicted because of a nuisance complaints from my neighbors, but mostly because of my job. I live in Midlands now.
What do you do for a living, sir?
I write biographies, which actually means I ask other people what they do for a living, so it's a little odd being on the opposite side of that, being interviewed now, but you're doing a great job, Mr. Sridhar.
Thank you. Who have you written about?
I've written about everybody from heroes like Paul Revere to villains like the 1987 Los Angeles Lakers, the 1988 Lakers, and Magic Johnson. But right now, my biggest project was the famous author Agatha Lee.
Oh, how did you become Miss Lee's biographer?
In 2015, I wanted to write about her, so I sent her a letter asking her if I could interview. Like most women I talked to, she didn't respond to me, but 3 years later, one of her people reached out and they invited me to the house, saying I could write my book.
Well, how long did you work with Miss Lee?
That was about 6 months, starting in February of 2018 through August. We met every week. I never expected to become friends with an 82-year-old woman, but Agatha was pretty cool. I interviewed her a lot.
Who else was at Miss Lee's house when you'd visit her?
For the most part, for the first 5 months, I think it was just this lady named Drew Mars. I think she took care of Agatha.
Well, then let's talk about Miss Mars. What did you observe about her relationship with Miss Lee?
From what I saw, they were inseparable. I mean, Agatha loved all this old people stuff, shuffleboard, backgammon, eating dinner at 4:30 p.m. And Drew was doing all of it with her. It was heartwarming, honestly.
Well, then let's talk about Miss Lee's relationship with the plaintiff in those 5 months.
Sure.
Did you ever hear the plaintiff talking to Miss Lee on the phone?
No, I heard Agatha talking about Stevie, always just complaining about it, like my dad complains about me, but I never heard them talking to each other, no.
Well, did you see any emails or letters from the plaintiff to Miss Lee?
I didn't see any of that, no, sorry, sir.
Did you ever get a chance to meet the plaintiff?
Actually, yeah, I did. I think July 6th, I went into the house to interview Agatha, but Stevie was there. I was kind of surprised. I didn't know Stevie and Agatha had been in contact, but Agatha looked pretty happy about it. She was smiling.
Well, you say Agatha Lee seemed happy to have the plaintiff back in her life. Well, I want to be clear. Now, in the next few months, did you ever hear Miss Lee say she was planning to give the plaintiff money?
No, I didn't hear that, sir.
Or did you hear Miss Lee say she wanted to write the plaintiff back into her will?
No.
When was the last time you met Agatha Lee?
That was August 14th, 2018. I was taking Agatha out to lunch. I usually like to go somewhere nice, but Olive Garden was closed this time, so we had to go to a steakhouse instead. I thought Agatha was bummed about the lack of breadsticks. She seemed pretty downcast, so I asked her about it.
Did you ask Agatha Lee why she seemed sad?
Yeah, it wasn't about the breadsticks. I asked her and she said, Stevie asked me for something today and I had to say no. I hope.
Objection to hearsay, Your Honor.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor. This statement actually falls under a rather unusual portion of Rule 8033. Now, Rule 8033 makes a specific allowance for statements of memory as they pertain to the terms and conditions of a will. Now, it's our contention that when Agatha Lee told Mr. Cabrera, Stevie asked me for something and I had to say no, Ms. Lee was referring to that conversation she had immediately beforehand, whereas we heard during the direct examination of Ms. Mars, Agatha Lee told the plaintiff, no, I'm not going to re-allow you into my will. Thus, this falls under Rule 8033.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
Your Honor, the will exception in 8033 still requires that it's also an otherwise admissible 8033 statement. It can only be a statement about, as 8033 explains, a then existing mental state. So it could be a statement like, I'm sad about the will, or I'm planning to write a will, but the statement can't be specific enough to say that I want to put somebody back in the will, or I had to tell Stevie I'm not putting her in the will. That's not covered by 8033, that's just hearsay.
Response?
Yes, Your Honor, we agree in a general sense that that's true about Rule 8033, but as you can see in that last sentence, it says not including a statement of memory or belief to prove the fact remembered or belief unless it relates to the validity or terms of the will. And so this recollection of that earlier conversation about the terms of the will, that's a statement of memory to prove the fact remembered that in fact Agatha Lee said no to the plaintiff.
May I respond to that, Your Honor?
Briefly.
The memory exception for will only allows for otherwise admissible 8033 statements when they go to memory, whereas most 8033 statements can't go to memory. But it still has to be an admissible 8033 statement of a then existing mental state. Saying I had to say no to Stevie Rogers, that's not a mental state.
Counselor, I believe the witness testified that Miss Lee was down. He asked why, she explained why. Therefore, I'm going to admit this as a mental state, and you go to the last sentence of 8033, but well argued on both sides. Objection is well taken, but overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor.
No. What did Miss Lee say when you asked her why she seemed sad?
She said, Stevie asked me for something today. I had to say no. I hope Stevie will forgive me.
Did you ever hear from Miss Lee again?
I know that was the last time. I got a phone call the next day from Drew. She was sobbing through the phone. I could barely understand her, but at the end, she said that Agatha passed away.
Thank you, Mr. Cabrera. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Cabrera, I want to talk a little bit more about why you're here today, all right?
Sure.
So you were Agatha Lee's biographer, isn't that true?
That's right.
You would say that Agatha Lee is the most famous mystery novelist in America.
That sounds about right.
Sir, you know that she wrote a book called Death in a Bottle, right?
Yeah, that's the only book she wrote.
That book, it sold over 65 million copies, right?
That's right.
It was translated into over 100 different languages.
I think so, yeah.
She wrote that book all the way back in the 60s, right?
That's right.
And she never published another book. Isn't that true?
That's right. I think she might have been worried about making a bad sequel, kind of like Cars 2.
Well, sir, you actually know that Agatha Lee wrote several other books that she never published, right?
That's right. She had a lot of books that she had been working on, but she hadn't finished them.
You know that any of those books from the most famous mystery novelist in America could be worth millions of dollars.
Maybe.
Objection, Your Honor, to lack of personal knowledge. May I be heard?
You may.
Your Honor, we've heard no foundation that this witness is any sort of expert in appraising the values of different literary works. And now Mr. Besman's asking him to offer some sort of appraisal to say whether something could be in the range of millions of dollars. And they just haven't laid the foundation with this witness to offer that sort of conclusion, even if it's couched in words like could be.
May I respond, Your Honor? Your Honor, the foundation is based on Agatha Lee's last book. The witness testified that Agatha Lee's last book sold over 65 million copies and was translated into over 100 different languages. So it's an admissible lay opinion under Rule 701 to use those rationally based perceptions to conclude that any future book could be worth millions of dollars.
Overruled, the witness can answer based on his knowledge, whatever that is.
Yes, Your Honor.
So, sir, you would say that any of those books by Agatha Lee could be worth millions of dollars. Isn't that right?
I don't know, maybe.
Well, you would say that you couldn't even fathom how much some of the more expensive ones would be worth.
Yeah, I don't know how much they'd be worth. They could be garbage. I don't know.
You know that there's over a dozen of those unpublished books, right?
Yeah.
You really want those unpublished books.
Yeah, I think it'd be cool to read them, maybe add on something to the biography. Yeah.
So the reason that you really want them is because you can't fathom how much they'd be worth.
I don't know about that.
Well, sir, isn't it true that you learned that Stevie Rogers was offering those books to you and your first thought was, I can't even fathom how much these would be worth?
Stevie didn't offer them to me, no.
So let's fast forward to that. Stevie Rogers called you in June, the defendant called you in June 2020, isn't that right?
That sounds about right, yeah.
The defendant asked you to be a witness for her in this case.
Yeah, she asked me if I had anything to say, and I had heard some things with Agatha, so I agreed.
That's right. You said, yeah, sure, I'd be happy to.
Right.
The defendant said, great. On an unrelated note, is there anything that belonged to Agatha Lee that you might like to have?
Yeah, and I wanted the books. I wanted to read them.
That's right. You said you wanted that book collection. Isn't that true?
That's right.
The defendant said, sure.
She did.
When the defendant said, sure, you thought to yourself, I can't even fathom how much those books would be worth.
I mean, yeah, I don't know how much they're worth.
Sir, you believe that whether or not you get those books is consistent or is dependent on your testimony today.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I'm not sure I understand.
Sure, you believe that if you testify well today, you'll get that collection.
Oh, I don't know about that. I think Drew's just going to give them to me no matter what.
Well, the defendant actually told you, I'd be happy to give you those books as long as this trial ends and I'm still in possession of Agatha Lee's estate.
I mean, yeah, Drew needs to have the books to give them to me.
Now, sir, I want to talk a little bit more about what you know about the defendant and Agatha Lee, all right?
Okay.
You've seen the defendant giving Agatha Lee medicine, isn't that true?
That's right. She was Agatha's nurse.
That's right. You know, as her nurse, it was her responsibility to hand the defendant medicine.
That's what she did, yeah.
You saw the defendant giving Agatha Lee pills in the past, didn't you?
That's right.
You remember one time the defendant gave Agatha Lee a pill and tried to explain what that pill was, right?
Yeah, Drew was saying what was in the pill.
Agatha Lee interrupted the defendant. Isn't that true?
But that's right.
Agatha Lee told the defendant you could skip the recitation, dear.
That's right. I don't know what recitation means, but she did say that.
Agatha Lee told the defendant, you know, I'll just take whatever you give me.
That's right. I'd probably take what my nurse gave me too.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
None, Your Honor. The witness may be excused.
All right, thank you, Mr. Cabrera. You're excused. We will now move to closing arguments. And before we do, if everyone will please set your screen to speaker view. All right, and we'll start with closing argument from the plaintiff.
Thank you, Your Honor. May it please the court. It wasn't enough. At the beginning of today's trial, the judge asked my co-counsel to introduce herself, and she said, "Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Madeline Driscoll, and I represent the plaintiff." She didn't pause. She didn't hesitate. She didn't have to. There was nothing else to say because that was the truth. You see, the truth is easy. It never changes, no matter who's asking, when, or why. But that isn't the way that the truth works for the defendant. In February of 2018, the defendant sent an email saying, "I just found out I'm getting Agatha Lee's entire estate when she dies. The money, the cars, the house, everything." Then, when people are watching her and the will is read, the defendant said, "Oh my God, I had no idea I would get everything. I'm so surprised." And now the defendant comes to court today and says, "All right, you got me. I really did know." Through all that time, the truth never changed, but the defendant's story did. That's because the defendant couldn't tell the truth. Because if the defendant wanted to get away with it, the truth wouldn't be enough. You see, this defendant knew she would get everything if Agatha Lee passed away. The defendant testified under oath that her family needed that money. She had a sister who was seriously, terminally ill, and without that windfall of money she could expect, she wouldn't be able to help her family pay those medical bills. But then on August 14th, the defendant overheard a conversation. The defendant heard Agatha Lee saying, "You know what, Stevie Rogers is out, or Stevie Rogers is back in, and I think I'm going to take Drew Mars out of the will." Members of the jury, the defendant panicked. She thought about her savings. She thought about how she was going to support her family, and she realized it just wasn't enough. She said to herself, "No way." She drove to a pharmacy. She picked up a bottle of chlorandramine, a drug that this trained nurse knew Agatha Lee was fatally allergic to, and she switched it out with Agatha Lee's pills. Agatha Lee died because she trusted this defendant. And that's why we're here in court today. Now, I want to be clear about something. This isn't a criminal case. I'm not a government attorney, and the defendant enjoys no presumption of innocence today. Before you came to court, you might never have heard the term Slayer statute, but you probably could have guessed that a plan like the defendant's isn't legal. See, the law tells us you can't profit off of a death that you caused. So all we have to do is prove by a preponderance of the evidence, just that it's more likely than not that the defendant purposefully caused Agatha Lee's death. Now, when you're asking yourself whether that's true, I want you to try to think about what an innocent person would do if they just discovered the person in their care had died for no apparent reason under suspicious circumstances. I'll tell you what they wouldn't do. An innocent person wouldn't say, well, there's no reason to look into it. There's no reason to investigate. Let's just cremate the body. But that's exactly what the defendant did. You see, this defendant never thought an investigation would happen. She thought she could just write it off as natural causes, but that wasn't enough for the police. You learned today that a private investigator and the police force came to that house and asked the defendant if they could take a look around. The police asked, can we look in your room? I mean, the defendant had let them look around the entire rest of the house, so what would be the harm in just taking a look in her room? But the defendant said, absolutely not. Nobody's getting a look inside of my room. You better come back with a warrant. And so they did. And we learned exactly what the defendant was hiding. Stuffed in a black bag inside the defendant's closet, there was that bottle of the chlorandramine pills that she used to kill Agatha Lee. But today the defense wants you to believe that all of it is just a coincidence, or better yet, a conspiracy. They want you to believe that Stevie Rogers killed her own grandmother, and everything just happens to line up by accident. They want you to believe that the defendant lied because she was nervous. The defendant didn't allow anybody to search because maybe she was angry. The pills were in her closet because they were planted. Now, members of the jury, if we had no other evidence in a civil preponderance case, that would already be a pretty shaky defense. But today we can prove that's not true. The way we know that is because the police did a forensic testing on the black bags with the pill inside of it. The police found a 16-point match for the defendant's thumb on the zipper of that bag. Now, I want you to think about the defendant's excuse. The defendant testified, well, I don't know, I might have moved it. The police didn't find that fingerprint on the outside of the bag. They found it on the zipper that you use to open and close the bag. Members of the jury, if this is all some big conspiracy, how did Stevie Rogers get the defendant's fingerprint on that bag? How did Stevie Rogers know the defendant's fingerprint would be on that bag? How did Stevie Rogers know that the defendant would go to a pharmacy that very same day? How did Stevie Rogers know that the defendant would lie? She couldn't. She didn't. And members of the jury, we can all sympathize with the defendant. We know she didn't have very much money before she took this job. We know that she had a sibling who was very sick. Nobody deserves to be in that situation. But Agatha Lee didn't deserve to die either. Agatha Lee was kind to the defendant. Agatha Lee tried to help the defendant. Agatha Lee gave the defendant a job, housing, food, a salary. She paid for her nursing school. She gave her all of it, but none of it was enough. Agatha Lee gave this defendant a good life, but it wasn't enough. So the defendant took another life, too. Find her liable. Thank you.
Defense?
Yes, Your Honor. And just so we confirm, Your Honor, would you be all right with us putting up the visuals that we constructed earlier in trial at various points during this statement?
I have no objection, no problem with that. Defense, plaintiff, excuse me, do you have any problems?
No objection, Your Honor.
All right.
May it please the court, members of the jury, it was murder, but it wasn't Mars. On August 15th, 2018, Drew Mars found Agatha Lee dead in her bedroom. She was 82 years old. Minutes later, Miss Mars told the plaintiff that, and the plaintiff's reaction was immediate. Now, the plaintiff didn't stand there shocked. The plaintiff's immediate reaction to finding her only living family member dead was to hire a private investigator. And by the time that investigator arrived, the plaintiff was calling Drew Mars a murderer. Think about that. In less than an hour, the plaintiff went from learning Agatha Lee was dead to declaring it was a murder and picking a suspect. And if you want to know how she got there so fast, without an autopsy, a toxicology report, her own private investigator finishing his investigation, really any evidence, that's pretty simple. Well, the plaintiff went to sleep the previous night knowing Agatha Lee would be dead when she woke up. The plaintiff went to sleep knowing a piece of evidence was hidden behind the right door. The plaintiff went to sleep knowing she was well on her way to being $25 million richer. And you know what? She knew all of that for a fact, because it's easy to be confident when you're the killer. It's easy to be confident when you're going to pin it on someone else. This was murder, but it wasn't Mars. It was the plaintiff. And this lawsuit filed 5 days later, it's the last step in the plaintiff's plan. See, this trial is about Agatha Lee's $25 million estate, whether it should go to the plaintiff or Drew Mars. And as you heard today, Agatha Lee, she made her choice. She wrote it down in a will. She had it signed. She had it witnessed. She chose Drew Mars as her beneficiary, and she specifically excluded the plaintiff. That will is legally binding with one exception, an exception that the plaintiff has known about for a while. See, as Mr. Besman said, you might not have heard of the Slayer statute before today, but the plaintiff had. The plaintiff knew that if she could make sure Agatha Lee was dead and she could pin it on Drew Mars, then that will would get overturned and the plaintiff would receive the entire estate no matter what Agatha Lee wanted. But this time in court, members of the jury, it wasn't enough for the plaintiff to point at Miss Mars and call her a killer. They had to prove it by a preponderance of the evidence. They had to answer your questions. You're their audience, members of the jury. You're the audience for this $25 million setup. And it was murder, but it wasn't Mars. First, we're going to talk about how we know the killer isn't Drew Mars, how that story falls apart when you look a little closer and you start asking questions about it. And then even though we have no burden of proof, we will show you why we agree there's a murderer in this courtroom, but it's not Mars. It's the woman who's been making accusations for 2 years. And when you look at the plaintiff's story of what happened, you have to look for answers to 2 questions. Why would Drew Mars do this? How would Drew Mars do this? Motive and means. Well, let's start with motive. And Mr. Besman's a good salesman, but this is a tough sell because you met Drew Mars today and she isn't a greedy woman. She had one employer her entire life, the plaintiff, Agatha Lee. And she was a devoted caretaker, and it's true. Miss Mars had a sibling with medical bills, but we didn't hear any evidence that Drew Mars couldn't get a loan, that she ever asked for a raise and was denied. And no reason to think her sister was on her deathbed, no reason to think this would motivate her to commit murder. And see, that's not an assumption you can just make. And so it shouldn't surprise you that the only evidence the plaintiff has really presented a motive is the plaintiff's word. Now, the plaintiff claims that on the morning of August 14th, she had a conversation with Agatha Lee, and Agatha Lee said, you know what? You're going to be the sole inheritor of my will. I'm going to give you everything. And the plaintiff claims that conversation is the key to this whole trial. That conversation, that pivotal moment, that's when Drew Mars goes from a caretaker to a murderer. So if that conversation is so important, what does it say about the plaintiff's case that there's no evidence to back that account up? Mr. Bond said that was an important part of his investigation. He said motive was crucial. And Ms. Burdett asked him, well, what evidence did you have? And he said, I just had my client's word, his paying customer. Drew Mars said that conversation went in a very different direction, that Stevie Rogers brought up the will, and Agatha Lee said, I love you, but I'm not going to continue to support this lifestyle. I'm not giving you a penny. And members of the jury, when you have these 2 different accounts of what happened, you have to look at the corroborating evidence. That's where Ryan Cabrera comes in. Because Mr. Cabrera, he spoke to Agatha Lee right after that conversation. And what he says, it doesn't support the plaintiff's story. It supports Drew Mars' account. You heard that Agatha Lee was downcast and she said, Stevie asked me for something and I had to say no. I hope Stevie forgives me. Now, those aren't the words of a woman who just promised Stevie Rogers $25 million to play with. And Mr. Besman brings up, well, there was a conversation with the lawyers. Agatha Lee was talking to her lawyers that day. Members of the jury, you heard Agatha Lee is a millionaire, and the entirety of her wealth comes from a single copyrighted work. There are plenty of reasons she'd call a lawyer that have nothing to do with that wealth. And so when you look at the evidence, it doesn't paint the picture of Drew Mars as someone who was motivated to kill. She wasn't the killer. It was murder, but it wasn't Mars. And then you're going to have to ask the plaintiff how they think Drew Mars killed Agatha Lee. And members of the jury, this is really where the plaintiff's story starts to fall apart. This is where it becomes clear it wasn't Mars. Because to believe Mr. Besman, you have to believe that Drew Mars is both incredibly cunning and incredibly stupid. Remember the fingerprints they talked about? You have to believe that Miss Mars was so careful that when she opened that bottle of chloroandramine, she was wearing gloves. That's why there were no smudges or fingerprints on it. But then when she zipped up the bag, she took the gloves off and got her fingerprints all over it. Members of the jury, you have to believe she is so cold-blooded that she would kill the woman she worked for 10 years in her sleep. But so stupid that she wouldn't throw away the chloroandramine, wouldn't hide it. She would leave it in her unlocked bedroom, in her unlocked closet, and wait for the police to come and find it. And members of the jury, if you have to believe that someone is both cunning and evil at the same time, there's a pretty good chance that person's being set up. And that's something we know about the plaintiff right now, is she's not very good at setting someone up. So how do we know it's her? Members of the jury, let's look at the plaintiff's financial history with Agatha Lee. Now, in 2008, the plaintiff inherited $2 million. And she was in line to get Agatha Lee's money too. So what does she do? For 7 years, she basically pretends her grandmother doesn't exist. She said something interesting today. Ms. Rogers said, I like to write letters. When we asked her why she didn't call her grandmother, and then we asked, well, did you write letters to your grandmother? And she said, no, I didn't. That's how much the plaintiff cared about Agatha Lee, members of the jury. Even in 2018, when the plaintiff was finally out of the will, when Agatha Lee said, I've had enough, she said, I wasn't sweating it. Members of the jury, the plaintiff says that she cared that that relationship was broken, but she didn't really, not enough to do something about it. June of 2018, that's when it was clear that that $2 million trust fund, enough to set most of us up for life. For the plaintiff, that wasn't enough. And so what does the plaintiff say? She says, well, grandma, she has millions of dollars. She wrote me out of the will. Let me get back in her good graces. A month later, she's at her doorstep. And you know what? We agree with Mr. Besman that on the morning of August 14th, the plaintiff had a conversation about that will with Agatha Lee. But members of the jury, the balance of the evidence tells us that when Stevie Rogers asked to be put back in the will, Agatha Lee's answer was no. Members of the jury, of course she said no. The plaintiff was trying to use her for money for 10 years. That's what their relationship had become. And then you know what Agatha Lee did? She left the plaintiff home alone. The plaintiff was remembering a few important things. Her grandmother was deathly allergic to a drug she could buy at the pharmacy. Drew Mars' bedroom, Drew Mars' closet, they didn't have locks on them. And if the plaintiff could kill Agatha Lee but blame it on Drew Mars, then it didn't matter what Agatha wanted. The plaintiff would get the whole estate. So the plan was simple. Get the pills, put 2 in the pill organizer, and leave the rest in Drew Mars' room. And if Miss Mars saw that strange bag in her closet, she tried to move it, she tried to pick it up, she tried to open it to see what was inside, well, then the plaintiff would even get forensic evidence. And all the plaintiff had to do was wait. Wait for Drew Mars to find the body, and then start making accusations. And something about that accusation was fundamentally right, because it was murder. But it wasn't Mars. It was a woman who had burned through $2 million, who asked for $25 million more and said no, and said, Agatha's letting me live at her house. She's giving me food. She paid for my education, but that isn't enough. I need the rest. It was the plaintiff. Now, we can't bring Agatha Lee back, but we can make sure her estate goes to the right person. The person a signed, sworn document tells us she wanted it to go to. Fine for Drew Mars. Thank you.
Rebuttal?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. Mr. Shreether just told you it was a setup. What a setup it would have to be. You see, in order for Stevie Rogers to have been the one to commit this crime and then frame Drew Mars, Stevie Rogers would have had to first switch out the pills undetected, second, get the chloroandramine, third, go into Drew Mars's closet and plant it without leaving any forensic evidence herself, fifth, know that the defendant would leave forensic evidence, sixth, know that the defendant would be going to a pharmacy that very day. The plaintiff would have to know exactly what this defendant was going to do, and the plaintiff would also have to know that trained investigators wouldn't see it coming. You see, members of the jury, you might remember that Ms. Burdett said something in her opening statement. She said that Drew Mars was the only thing standing in between Stevie Rogers and $20 million. If Drew Mars was the only thing standing in between Stevie Rogers and $20 million, then why would Stevie Rogers kill Agatha Lee? She didn't. It was a murder, and it was Drew Mars. Find her liable. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. That concludes the trial. Judges, if you'll now complete your ballots, and I believe our bailiff will take over to facilitate all of that.
Yeah, that's right. I'm going to go ahead and stop